This is Ayani.
And this is Corinne.
And you're listening to Sex, Love, Literature, a pop culture podcast where we take a semi-scholarly look at why
and how
the sex stuff in media matters.
This episode, we're doing something a little different. So earlier this month, Ayani and I participated in the Let's Talk About Sex in YA conference hosted by the University of Cambridge, although held virtually over Zoom.
So as you can see, right up our alley, we actually partnered with Dr. Leah Phillips, who is, quote, an early career researcher in the field of YA studies, but also our buddy. We like her a lot. To put on the paper, Tamora Pierce was my Judy Blume, sex ed in young adult fantasy. It was kind of more of an interview. I acted as the moderator, interviewer, with Corinne and Dr. Phillips as the interesting interview.
So to give you a little bit of context about how academic conferences normally work, in case you are not familiar. So normally at conferences, a whole bunch of academics with similar research interests. So in this case, sex and YA. But so we get together and present pieces of our sort of ongoing research to each other in order to get new perspectives and feedback. These presentations, I did in fact hear Chloe just then. So in case you're wondering, that is Ayani's psychotic cat, Chloe.
Oh, yeah, you're not wrong.
I have noticed. So what's been happening for virtual conferences is that people will then record themselves presenting their paper, and many cats have made an appearance. So, this is just in keeping with that.
She's hungry.
But one of the things that I thought would be fun for this, because one of the things I really miss about getting to do conferences in person is getting to talk to other people and actually sort of have discussions and not just have like me talking at my living room, which I did a lot of when I was teaching online. But so I reached out to Leah because we both do a lot of work on young adult fantasy and particularly on Tamora Pierce to see if she wanted to collaborate. I think we met through Twitter, actually.
Twitter is like great for academic relationships, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, but so we met through Twitter, and then we'd met in person a couple of times at a number of conferences. And I thought it would be fun for us, since I knew we were both presenting on Tamora Pierce, and we'd have this conversation at IRSCL, or the International Research Society and Children's Literature Conference in Stockholm, I guess at this point, a year and a half ago, about how Tamora Pierce, who is this sort of foundational fantasy young adult author, had functioned as a seminal figure for us in like how we learned about sex. But we were both presenting on different angles of this for this conference in the abstracts or brief summaries of our arguments that we had submitted to this conference. So we decided to join forces and have a sort of podcast style presentation instead.
So that's what you're going to be listening to when you play this episode. It's a lot of fun. I had a great time kind of as a moderator. While I do study fantasy, I really only know Tamora Pierce because of my childhood reading. It's not my bag, but the conversation was a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoy listening to this podcast presentation that is definitely in the sex, love, literature vein. Though perhaps maybe a little bit different tonally since it's more of an interview.
So this presentation / podcast might get a little bit more academic than what you're used to on the podcast, but it'll give you a taste of what we do in our more everyday work as PhD candidates and academics.
So yeah, as we always say, and now on to the show.
Tell me to stop if you don't like it. Tell me I'm unwelcome and I'll go. He said it in all seriousness, his eyes sharp on my face. I've yet to push myself on a woman who doesn't like me. Tell me to piss off, Becca. No, I snapped instead. I felt him chuckle more than I heard it. Then we still have a game.
Oh my. Oh my goodness. So why this quote? Where is this? What is this? Why?
So that is from Bloodhound, the second book in Tamora Pierce's Becca Cooper trilogy, and it is Dale, who is romancing our main character, Becca. And I like this quote because it's interesting to think about in terms of consent, because it's an instance where Becca saying no means yes, and that's very clear from the context. So it makes us think about consent a little bit in an unexpected way. What do y'all think?
I mean, I felt him chuckle more than I heard it. I was like,
I knew you were going there. I also like that it's so clearly Becca. Like, she's this kind of gruff, seeing soft sides of her is kind of rare. So, like, her saying yes, going, no, I snapped instead, is kind of classic Becca.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, and because her flirtation style is very, pretending that she doesn't like it when she does. So for, Dale to be like, okay, but, if you really don't like it, I'm not gonna, is so important, but that she's able to maintain her personality while communicating what she wants. Also, just then we still have a game is so funny.
Yeah, right?
She gets so playful with him in a way that she's not normally, or with anybody else that she's with in the series. He brings out a playful side in her that is just amazing.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, hello there. Let's talk about Sex and YA conference, folks. My name is Ayani Cooper, and I have a very special treat for you today. Welcome to the podcast paper. Tamora Pierce was our Judy Blume, sex ed in YA fantasy, featuring the lovely Corinne Matthews and the fantastic Dr. Leah Phillips.
Hello.
Hi.
So today, instead of giving you two separate conference-style conference papers, you're going to be getting a little bit of a treat in which these two fantastic scholars are coming together to talk about some of their most favoritist reading materials of all time. But before we launch into our conversation proper, by way of quick introduction, as I said, my name is Ayani Cooper. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Florida who studies monsters, monstrosity, desire, fun things like that. And your main speakers for today, I'm going to turn it over to them. Corinne, who are you?
Hello, I'm Corinne Matthews. I am also a PhD candidate in the Department of English at the University of Florida. I specialize in children's literature, and my dissertation is on consent in contemporary young adult speculative fiction. I also co-host the podcast Sex, Love, Literature with Ayani, which is what inspired this presentation. And I am enjoying not being in the driver's seat and instead making Ayani do all the work.
I forgot that's why I'm here. Yes, we do co-host a podcast together, don't we? I just launched right into it. So, Leah, who are you? Tell the people.
Now that is the question, really, isn't it? I am Dr. Leah Phillips. I am an early career academic and the president and founder of the YA Studies Association. And
Yay!
It is a good, fun thing. And I guess the biggest thing about me at the moment is that I'm finishing up a book project, finally, called Female Heroes in Young Adult Fantasy Fiction, Reframing Myths of Adolescent Girlhoods. It's going to be with my editor in July, so academic publishing takes ages, but it's on the trajectory to getting out in the world.
That is super exciting. I wish they could see our faces because I was just making big silly grins because that's super exciting.
I mean, I say some horrible things about Bella Swan and Katniss Everdeen in the book.
As one does.
I say some even more horrible things about Walt Disney's Cinderella, and then say some really cool things about girls in a certain genre of YA fantasy that I'm really interested in.
Oh, so this is just going to be filled with spicy hot takes, is
Basically,
what I'm hearing?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Excellent. I think it's important perhaps to establish some context about what it is you guys are going to be talking about today. So, who is Tamora Pierce? Am I saying Tamora Pierce correctly?
That's a question.
The question for the ages.
One she debates on her website.
She debates how to pronounce her own name?
Apparently it was a confusing thing, and it technically is Tamora.
Oh my god.
But everyone says Tamora.
Yeah, I grew up saying
did
Tamora.
too.
Like
I did too.
I'm glad to know it's Tamara, but like I don't know if I can fix it.
And I think, right, because that's what we've been saying. It's something to do with the name that was written down on your birth certificate and someone misspelling it, I think. And so that's, yeah, technically I'm 99.9% certain it's Tamara, but I'm going to say Tamora Pierce throughout because
Yep.
that is what I know.
That is so interesting. So, two really quick digressions. One, it's so interesting to think about words that we read and don't actually hear,
Yes.
especially coming from, I mean, we were all alive before the internet was really a thing. So these words that we didn't hear them, so we had to sound them out and figure them out for ourselves in a lot of ways. And two, my name was actually wrong on my birth certificate, so my parents had to get a correction. So on the back of my birth certificate, it was really simple. There was supposed to be an accent in my middle name and they didn't put it. They have like corrected name. So I totally get that. That's the thing that happens.
It's kind of it's an interesting record of how you and your name came into being, isn't it?
I would say so. But yeah, so tell us a little bit about Pierce. I'm just going to go with Pierce because my mind is blown.
So Tamora Pierce started publishing YA books in the early 1980s. Her first series was the Song of the Lioness Quartet. Really interestingly, she originally wrote it as an adult fantasy novel. It's a 732-page adult novel that she swears doesn't exist anymore. And I mean, she was writing before the advent of internet technology, so she very well probably has destroyed it. But it was an agent and then editor who suggested she retell this kind of adult novel about Alanna as 4 books for teenagers, is the quote on her webpage. And really, really glad that agent, Claire Smith's her name, suggested Pierce make those changes because it kickstarted what has become a genre that I call mythopoeic YA. That's doing some really cool interventionist work, which is one of the things that we're going to talk about, kind of the sex side of this interventionist work. But if she hadn't done that, if she hadn't made that suggestion, the trajectory of a whole couple of generations now of fantasy wouldn't possibly exist or exist in the way that it does. And that's kind of really mind-blowing to think about, that one small suggestion really kind of kick-started a whole movement.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to quickly say she then published the Immortals Quartet and the Protector of the Small Quartet, and then several others after that. So we've pretty much from 1983 to her most recent book in 2019 have a book every other year from Tamora Pierce.
Yeah. So to give people some context who may not be as familiar with the work of Tamora Pierce, she has published 29 books and some short stories and a spy's guide in like the last 40 years. Also, I think she had like breast cancer in that time, so like that. So she's incredibly prolific. And to help situate you further within the writing of her world, because we are going to probably end up name dropping way too many characters for us to go over now, she writes in two main worlds. One is the Tortal universe, and that's where you have Alanna the Lioness, Caladri, your like Lady Knights, your that whole kind of medievalism fantasy world. And the other world she writes in is the Circle universe, which is still the same sort of like pseudo-medieval situation, but it has a different system of magic. And instead of having series of books that focus on like one character's entire journey, she instead has a couple of sets of books that follow the same 4 main characters as they grow up. So what we'll be talking about the Tortal universe and the Circle universe. And Leah also alluded to this, but Pierce is like a direct influence on almost every YA fantasy writer, at least, writing right now. And it's not just like us being like, we wish you would take Tamora Pierce more seriously because we think this. Like, no, they say it. Like that, like they publicly acknowledge her as like an influence. So I was looking at one of my copies of Pierce's more recent books, and like in the like blurbs of people, you know, pushing it or praising it, like the author is quoted like is almost like a who's who of who's working in YA fantasy right now. So like it includes Leigh Bardugo, Holly Black, Sarah J. Maas, Ray Carson, Bruce Coville, Rachel Hartman, Garth Nix, Naomi Novik, Catherine Arden. Like she is such a huge influence.
Wild. Do you know, I was revising a section in my book today where I was talking about how Tolkien influenced Pierce. And as something struck me, partly because of the conversations we've been having about how as much as Tolkien influenced Pierce and kind of a whole generation of fantasy writers, Pierce is now doing that for a whole generation of YA fantasy writers. And yet, Corinne's right, we don't talk about her nearly enough.
And I do want to say, like, there are a handful of articles that people have written on Tamora Pierce. But one of the reasons Leah and I wanted to do this conference presentation is that, like, Tamora Pierce really isn't given her due. And, like, even when the few people who write about her do so, people almost always talk about Alanna. And Alanna's great. I love Alanna. Tamora Pierce has written at least 25 books since she wrote about Alanna.
I kind of want to segue here, and I might be kind of putting things before things, but Corinne, what was the first Tamora Pierce book you ever read?
So the first Tamora Pierce book I ever read was actually Sandry's book, which is the first book in the Circle of Magic world. The first quartet in there is Sandry's book, and then Triss's book, and Dodger's book, and then Briar's book. So like they're each named for the characters. And like I actually, to bring it back to sex, when I was growing up, I wasn't allowed to read the Alanna books because my mom knew there was sex in them. And I probably read them. I'm not sure if it was elementary school or middle school, but it was when I was quite young. And the Circle of Magic books, because they follow these characters starting from when they're like 9 or 10 instead of like going to, and we do end up like in The Will of the Empress with these characters at like 18 or 19. They're not having sex when they're 9 or 10. So like I was allowed to read those books in a way that I was not allowed to read the other books. So I did go back and read like Alanna and other books like that when I was in college to try and be like more of a completist, because I knew I loved Tamora Pierce, but I started with the Circle books. What about you, Leah?
You know what? The Immortals Quartet, Dane's books, and Dane's our shape-shifting heroine. That's the first one that I got into. And it was a friend of mine when I was, and this is showing my age, I was in high school, and one of my friends, Sarah, and actually I have Sarah to blame for everything now because she's the one who got me onto Tamora Pierce. She was like, go read this, go read this, go read this. And I was like, okay. And then, yeah, the rest is history. I've been writing on Tamora Pierce and thinking about her fantasy for way too long.
Well, I was also thinking, because I think, so my mom knew the Alanna books had sex in them, but like she didn't know necessarily like as more books came out that like that. I mean, I think I was older when the Becca books came out, but like when the Allie books came out, my mom had this book that like listed things to be wary of in various children's and young adult literature. I grew up in a very conservative environment.
That's a conversation we should have at some point. Yeah. Because I grew up in a different kind of conservative environment.
But that did shape what I was allowed to read. But then that also meant that when my mom didn't have the heads up about like these other books that I then wanted to read, because I wanted to read the work of this author that I knew that I liked, there's sex in the Allie books. But like my mom didn't know that, so I read them. But like then I was reading these books in which Alanna, like the mythology of Alanna the Lioness is part of those books. So like when I went to read the Alanna books, I already knew about her like as a myth and as a legend within the world before I knew her as a character.
Which is so interesting about this world, and one of the things that makes it such but I'm going to start doing sexual innuendos because we're thinking about sex. But like a vibrant, ripe, productive sort of space, right? That you can slip in and out of different parts of the world. Sorry.
No. Actually, I'm going to interject
You're going to jump
here
in with a question.
Yeah, because you guys are like brimming with information and wanting to talk. So really quickly though, why are you studying Pierce? You both kind of talked about how much you love her, and Leah, how your friend has kind of doomed you to an eternity of Pierce, right? But what is it about her work that makes you want to study it? And kind of as, or rather maybe, how does Pierce factor into your work? And kind of as a additional question, why, and this is a, not a devil's advocate question, but kind of a grumpy, snooty, nose in the air question that I also have an answer to, but like, why even study fantasy like this? You know, why, what is the fantastic bringing to the table? Like, obviously we all have an answer, you know, but why even study this, and why Tamora Pierce specifically in the umbrella of fantasy?
I'll let you take that first.
Oh, am I going to go first? This is one of the things I love the question, partly because while Corinne and I work on Pierce, we work on two very different things within the kind of umbrella of what Pierce does, which I love. I think it means we can have these fantastically wonderful conversations because like my interest is over here and hers is here. And sometimes they meet and overlap, but that's proof of point for one thing, that there is so much to talk about within the world of Pierce, that you've got 2 plus heaps. There are several other scholars doing work on Tamora Pierce, which is just exciting, and there's enough room for all of us at the table. I specifically focus on Tamora Pierce because I'm interested in adolescent girlhood, and I'm interested in pushing back against that kind of a dominant, right? We all grow up seeing the magazine images and the film productions that kind of subconsciously and sometimes overtly tell us that we're all supposed to look like Cinderella, the Disney one. And most of us don't, for like whole heaps of reasons, right? And so that's shit, to like say it in more eloquent terms than I will ever say it in my book.
I mean, for one thing, Cinderella is not a curly girl, so, you know.
Not okay.
And she's so sparkly and shiny and white, and yeah.
I mean, I'm very oily shiny right now, but not quite the same thing.
It's not as... Yeah. Okay, tangent. So for me, Pierce, because she's got Alanna who cross-dresses, she trades places with her twin brother so she can go to the palace to train to become a knight. She's got Dane, who shapeshifts, who, because she's a demigoddess, her mum's a mortal woman and her dad's a god, she has this connection with animals that means she can ultimately become different animals and also multiple animals all mixed up together because she's just got this amazing ability. Ooh. And you've also got Kel, who's like the quiet, non-magical, non-god touched, who also is pushing the boundaries of what it means to be a girl within this world. She's the second girl within Pierce's world to try to become a knight. And she doesn't have to disguise the fact that she's a girl like Alanna did. And then you've got Allie, who's Alanna's daughter, who's doing all these really cool trickster things. And for me, it's the bodies and the difference in the way they break, they bleed, they grow other bodies, they change into new bodies. That just keeps me going back time and time again. It's such a wealth of things to think about.
And what about you, Corinne?
So I kind of come at it from a different direction. So I think about consent a lot in my work, which then inevitably involves thinking about it. Well, it also involves thinking about sex education, how you learn how consent works. It involves thinking about birth control. It involves thinking as well about like sexual assault. And because Tamora Pierce has been writing for so long and has written so many stories, one of the things that I find very valuable in looking at her work is I can look at how Pierce is thinking about or using or depicting the way that consent works for Alanna, and then like compare it to how it's working for Becca, because Alanna was published in the 80s, Becca was published in the 2000s. So you can sort of see how that ideology is shifting as like these books, because these books are still a product of their time. But it's also, I think, very valuable. Well, because Tamora Pierce, first of all, has birth control built into these fantasy worlds that is wildly different from like the pill or condoms or whatever it is we do in real life, which is what originally made me think about
It's
it.
boring old.
You know? But like then when we have so many different stories of like different women who have sex for different reasons, use birth control for different reasons, have this multiplicity of relationships that I can then compare. And that's also useful for thinking about that, like, there are different kinds of relationships in life. And also to tie it back to this sort of question of why a fantasy, not just in relation to Pierce, but more generally, there is this sort of tendency to use how realistic is it as the measuring stick for how good it is. And I know that is especially the case. So like in the chapter that I'm working on right now, I'm thinking a lot about sexual assault, and a lot of the ways people think about like Laurie House Anderson's Speak and various other books that think about rape. It's like, well, like how much is it like the real world? And if it's not like the real world, it must be bad. And in fantasy, there are ways in which these situations can be like the real world, but it then forces us to ask different questions, because the point is not how realistic is it? It's what else can we imagine? What other possibilities does this illuminate for readers within these like various questions?
Without being preachy and teachy. I mean, I do love Judy Blume, right? I mean, I was that kid who that's probably one of the first times I read about sex was in Her Forever, that like iconic text. But it reads like an instruction manual in some ways, like how to take yourself to Planned Parenthood to get the pill, what it's going to be like the first. It's going to be awkward. It's going to like, it does that. But in Pierce's world, it's not that sex is like the story. It's part of our girl's story, which I know Corinne and I like fangirl over all the time.
Yeah.
So there's a definitive overlap, you know, just from hearing the kinds of things that you guys are looking at in Pierce. But we can only talk about so much in the context of a podcast, right? So obviously, sex is a very large umbrella term. There are a lot of things that fall under or into the bucket of sex, which is a terrible phrase, and I should not have said it. But there are a lot of things that fall into this kind of concept of sex. So when we're talking about Pierce, what kinds of things are you guys thinking about? I know a lot in my research, I think a lot about desire and how desire is functioning and how it's working. But it sounds like there are very specific things within Pierce that you all are thinking about and want to talk about today.
Me? I think it's a really interesting one. This is another one of those moments where I think the research that Corinne and I do like really slots in so nicely with one another, because I don't really think about consent, although there's one chapter where I think about consent in a kind of really lateral way that I now want to go and talk to Corinne about when we're not on a podcast about sex and YA, because it has nothing to do with sex whatsoever.
Cite each other.
That's
absolutely.
Like, yeah. Yes. But I'm interested in the kind of part of sex that deals like periods, right? We don't talk about periods in mainstream fiction, in films. I mean, like Katniss Everdeen goes into the Hunger Games and she never gets her periods. She also like lives in the poorest district of Panem and like has really well kempt body hair, which kind of goes into this sexuality thing. But the girls in Pierce's world get their periods. We see their first periods. We see them coming into terms with those. And that's, and Pierce does it really beautifully. It's not to say that like all girls have to get their period to be a girl, but for lots of girls, that is kind of part of the story. And so it gets included in their stories. I'm interested in that. And I'm interested in pregnancy, weirdly, because this is imaginary world fantasy, and we get stories starting with like 11-year-olds, but like Corinne was talking about, reading other books by Pierce and like seeing the echoes of Alanna's story before she actually read Alanna's story. We get to see Alanna, the 1983 heroine, as an adult woman with children in some of the later books. And so I'm interested in that part of sex for me. Periods and the messiness of kind of dealing with being a girl, because sometimes being a girl is messy.
Well, and it's also building on that, interesting how the way that Tamora Pierce sort of talks about periods develops
Yeah.
over the course of like the books that she writes. So like
Yeah.
I'm thinking about in Alanna has her first period. She has no idea what's happening. She has to like find a healer who like to tell her like what is going on, and also like she can't ask the palace healers because then they'll know she's a girl, and like it is a whole situation. And then she does learn about them, and it's a really good sequence that a lot of people have correctly analyzed. But like that, then we go to someone like Becca Cooper, who when we meet her is already like she's already kind of grown. She's like starting her first job, and she already knows what periods are. So like we don't see the same sort of like learning what periods are, learning what sex is, but we do see her like when she goes on a trip, like having to pack pads and like plan for like how many monthlies quote like she might have while she's there. We also see Becca having like cramps and like feeling kind of crappy when she's on her period, which like is just
I forgot about the cramps.
How could you forget about the cramps,
How
Leah?
could I forget about the cramps?
So it's just like a very mundane aspect in this fantasy world that like, I mean, feels very familiar to me, but also is then interesting. Like one of the things that Alanna asks Mistress Cooper, the healer she gets to, is like, oh, well, like, will this stop me? Will this hold me back? And Mistress Cooper says like, no. And I mean, unless you get pregnant, because like that'll probably hold you back. But
it's gonna slow you down.
But also thinking about that, I wouldn't necessarily, when on my period, wish to ride horses and fight with swords and like do all of that like at 100%. So there is like more layers added as Pierce goes on and like adds these additional characters who go through the same things but experience them differently.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, when you were talking about Becca, I know something that was not a shock to me, but like when I was in the working force for the first time and had terrible, terrible cramps, it's like, well, I can't just not go to work and be at home like I would not go to class necessarily or lay in the nurse's office, right? So I think it's interesting to think about how these things might impact fantasy heroines as, you know, their lives go on. But my cramps aside, are there any other, so we're thinking about kind of the practicalities of sex here. Are there any of, I think we talked a little bit about Alanna, we talked a little bit about Becca, but are there other places in Pierce's world, in her, I always want to say discography instead of bibliography when I'm talking about books, but are there other places in her bibliography where you're seeing kind of these practicalities of sex? I really like that phrase. Whichever one of you wrote it, like big thumbs up. But that we're seeing those things kind of not in the forefront as you're saying, but kind of making a major wave or a major statement, for lack of a better word, in her work.
So the really big one for me, and this is where a lot of my work comes in, I started thinking about contraception and young adult fantasy before I started thinking about consent. And although the article that I wrote about this ended up being about Kristen Kishore and her Graceling trilogy, which is actually no longer a trilogy because another one just came out. But
quartet? It's a quartet. We're talking a lot of quartets.
Well,
so
it's a quartet. And she's actually working on a fifth one. So like it is on. Anyway, I'm a Graceling fangirl. That is
quintet.
I think at this point we can just call
An
it
imaginary
a series.
World.
Oh, series?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
In the Graceling world? Gracing realms.
World. I like that. I like worlds. Worlds are good.
But so Kristen Kishore uses birth control in her Graceling series, which I look at. But in my article that I wrote about it, I also had to talk about how Tamora Pierce uses birth control in her fantasy world because it is such a direct influence. And in fact, Kristen Kishore even specifically says that Tamora Pierce's work and inclusion of birth control in her fantasy worlds was a sort of like, well, she did it, you can do it too kind of thing. So birth control in Tamora Pierce's worlds is then very interesting because she has these two different magical worlds that she can write in, that she comes up with two different kinds. So in the Tortel universe, it's an anti-pregnancy magical charm that different characters can wear. And that's very interesting to like think about, that like Alanna gets like an anti-pregnancy charm that she wears as like like an amulet kind of thing, I think. Like as a necklace. And then like Becca gets one later. And then when Becca gets one, because Becca is lower class, also like Allie uses one, Kel gets one too. Dane
all the
perhaps
girls
loses
too.
her. Yeah. So like
Yeah.
that's addressed in different ways for each one. But like, for example, when Becca gets one, because she's lower class, she worries about the quality of it, which is interesting to think about access and monetary privilege mattering for who gets it. But she also then, by making this an anti-pregnancy charm that women wear, has kind of written herself into a particular corner about whose responsibility it is to use birth control. So then when we go to the Circle series, or the Circle worlds, birth control instead is an herb that men take, which I find wildly fascinating. So there's an exchange here that I wrote down where a character tells Briar, who's like a little bit of a playboy, but like a responsible one, that like if he gets
a playboy,
basically saying like, if you get women pregnant, I hope you also give them a lot of money so that like they can deal with that. And Briar's response is like, responsibility is my middle name, droughtwort is my other middle name. And then it has in like a narrative aside, like the droughtwort herb rendered any man who ate it sterile for days. Briar was determined not to sire any children who might be left parentless if something happened to their mothers. And it's also important in this context to note that Briar is sort of like traveling. So this isn't just that he like is ghosting people. They know going into it that he's like there for a good time, not a long time. But like that is interesting because it affects who the agency is on to like use birth control. It also affects like who knows about it. And then there's layers of like, well, maybe he lied about taking it. And The Will of the Empress, the book that's from, is also a big old metaphor for rape culture. So thinking about how birth control is working in that book is particularly interesting. And also interesting then to think about consent, because the presence and use of birth control does not guarantee consent. It helps. It enables like all of our like lady characters to be able to have sex and not get pregnant, and therefore not have their whole stories be about the consequences of sex. But it doesn't guarantee them the agency to like make those decisions themselves. If like someone is making them use it, if someone is making them not use it, like there are layers here. But yeah, birth control.
Leah, did you want to kind of?
It's interesting. And it's listening to Corinne talk about the way birth control is happening in the Tortle universe and the way it's happening in the Circle universe, and how I love that about Pierce's two kind of worlds. They comment and complement one another in some beautiful ways. But in both worlds, it's a question of power, isn't it? And it's a question of power on the body in a really kind of Foucauldian sense, and how power plays work. And it's so great to see our girls in the Tortle universe empowered in a certain way because they can access birth control and they know where it is. Yeah.
That reminds me, actually, if we're thinking about power over the body, another way that fantasy is particularly interesting to think about consent is because these worlds include magic. And something that is very interesting to me about the Alanna series is Alanna hates it when people use magic on her.
She does.
And she is very clear about not consenting to that. And
interesting.
And it's almost like Tamora Pierce, and I've noticed that this in a number of works by other fantasy authors, that they are more clear about the rules of consent when it comes to magic being used on someone often than they are about sex.
Ooh, that's a spicy take that I'd like to see an article on at some point.
This is where my thinking is going with Dane, her shapeshifter, right? So in the Tortle and Circle universes, apart from kind of those early Circle books, because they're really too young to be dealing with too much about kind of sex and birth control and periods and those sorts of things, Dane is the kind of outlier in the Pierce world. She's of the age where you'd be thinking about periods, where you'd be thinking about birth control, where you'd be thinking about all of those kinds of issues that go with sex. But Dane's got other things going on, right? She's like found out she's a demigoddess. She's learning how to shapeshift. She's like got a whole bunch of stuff on her plate. And we don't really think about consent and birth control and in the kind of sex ways. But part of Dane's learning to shapeshift is how she develops her connection with the animals that she shares a bond. So there's some really beautiful passages where she tries to shapeshift by like enforcing her will on the animal that she wants to become. She like she glues herself to them. She glues them to her. She sews them together like in her mind's eye. But it's not until she puts herself in a place of reciprocality. She starts listening. She starts listening to their thoughts. She starts seeing through their eyes. And it's when she takes herself out of the position of authority and starts entering into a relationship with these animals that she then starts to enter into the full extent of her power. So it has nothing to do with sex. It has nothing to do with consent in the way we're thinking about it today, but it has everything to do with consent and with power.
Well, and that also reminds me, like when I'm thinking about consent, like in my work, and one of the reasons I think it is so interesting and important to look at the way consent is working in children's and young adult literature is like people can't just be expected to know how to navigate and understand and work with consent in a good, effective way when they're having sex if they don't know how to work with it and use it in other arenas of their life. It's a learned skill. It's not something you just are told about and then know how to do. So thinking about consent in these other arenas that are perhaps easier to talk about or easier to apply, but also being wary of things like the tea metaphor, which is often, I think, oversimplifies a little bit the whole consent thing. That like thinking about it in these other areas is really, really important and helpful. And I think is a way that YA fantasy is particularly able to do.
It's another reason we should be looking at fantasy and another reason we should be looking at Tamora Pierce, because you get all of these nuanced discussions across our corpus.
So actually picking up some threads from the conversation, right? If we're talking about animals and shape-shifting and relationships.
All over the place.
It's all over. I love it though.
I know where you're going.
So I am I don't want to say the Tamora Pierce baby here, but I've only read 2 of her works, The Trickster duology, which as a teen I absolutely loved. But the thing that I remember the most from those books is the fact that there was a sexy crow man named Nawat. And I don't remember most of the story, but I remember him being hot in my head and him giving a birth control charm to Allie. That's like what I recall. So
also, but to be clear, by crow man, it's a crow who turned into a man, not someone who is simultaneously.
That is very fair. Yes, he's not like a demi-crow human. He is a crow that turns into a man.
But still has the mind of a crow.
At will.
Yeah. At will. At will. So obviously, I was destined to be a monster scholar, right? If what sticks with me is the transforming crow man. But would you all say that Pierce is kind of making interesting moves with some of her romances and coupling? Does she complicate what we're expecting from YA romance? And I say we, both maybe us as scholars, but also us as pop culture readers, larger kind of conversations about what YA romances are, or should I just kind of sit with the fact that I remembered the hot bird man and that was it, and I have some like deep diving to do?
There is deep diving you could do. There's so many things running through my head.
It can be both.
It could be all of these things and more.
I mean, on a kind of very basic level, our girls get to have more than one love and more than one lover, which is kind of cool. And that becomes kind of more Corinne's kind of ballpark than mine. And maybe we want to start there, and then I can do some talking about sexy crow man and the implications of sexy crow man as a lover.
So going back really quickly and thinking about getting to have more than one love interest and sexual partner, like even at the beginning with Alanna starts out sleeping with Prince Jonathan, who is like the prince who like you think she's gonna end up with, like based on like various romance patterns, but she doesn't. She ends up breaking up with him, and she has another partner who's like a warrior dude, which is like a whole other thing. And then she ends up with George, who is like the king of thieves, like kind of almost like opposite of Prince Jonathan in a lot of ways. But then for me, that particular negotiation of relationships is interesting because Jonathan most of the time doesn't actually respect Alanna's consent and like what Alanna wants for her life, and George very much does. And that is like a pattern that Pierce sort of continues with, where we see a lot of our girls experience or like learn various things from their different romantic relationships and their different specifically sexual relationships that do not make them any less desirable as partners. So like another example that I'm thinking of is in the Becca Cooper trilogy. Like Becca doesn't really have a love interest in the first book. You could argue that Rosto kind of is, and also like I hardcore shipped her with Rosto, but alas, 'twas not to be.
It was never gonna work. It's never gonna work.
No, it was not. Yeah. But then in the second book,
but I agree.
In the second book, she has
lead syndrome.
Well, but also even going into that, Becca is already not a virgin. She has already slept with someone that is made explicit to us. And she's like, yeah, like I've had sex. Yeah. Wasn't that great for me? I'm gonna focus on my job. But then in the second book, she gets this love interest who is Dale, who has the quote that who is the source of the quote we started with, and he's like very fun, and she like learns that sex can be fun and that like you can laugh during it, which is something she says specifically. But then also like Dale ends up breaking up with her, which like I think in a footnote I put that like actually so it turns out Dale is a fuckboy because he basically is. But then in the space between Becca's second and third book, she ends up in kind of an abusive relationship. And like she gets engaged and her fiance dies, and she has a lot of really complicated feelings about that because she needed to break up with him because he was emotionally manipulative. There's some like suggestions that he may have even hit her. And she's like a badass, basically like kind of policewoman. And the policing in the Becca Cooper trilogy is another topic that someone should address. We're not going to get into the complications of that right now.
Podcast.
Yes. But I do want to acknowledge that, but also we're not going into the details of that. But like what she learns from Dale, from I can't remember his name, the abusive guy, and what she learns like along the way then influence her relationship with Farmer, who is a mage who she ends up with at the end of the trilogy. So like she learns about herself. She learns that like sex can be good. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, what?
Does she ever have sex with Farmer?
She
like they have a really cool relationship.
There's a really interesting moment in the third book where they're in like a dungeon and a prison, and they're kind of being set up.
Yeah.
Like, they're like put in the same cell, and like.
Yeah, but that's also where he has the magic thing stored in his and has to get it out.
Yes.
What?
See, this is one of the problems of talking about fantasy. It is setting how much detail should we give about what is happening.
So you guys just said he has a magic thing stored in his what, and then just left it. So I think for the purposes of our listeners, that needs a little bit, just a smidge.
They get very intimate because Farmer is a certain kind of mage within this world, and he has the ability to store his kind of magical reservoir both within himself and in external objects. And throughout the series, we know that he knows something bad is going to happen, something like terribly horrible, world-rifting bad is going to happen. So he's like squirreling away all this magic power, and he does that by embroidering. He embroiders his magic power, which is a hangover from Circle Universe.
That.
So he embroiders his magic into this kind of ribbon thing, and then he shoves it up his bum to store it so that when he's like searched, they're not going to find it. And when he and Becca reunite in the dungeon, he has to get it out.
Yes.
So they have this like finally realize their romantic moment in the dungeon, and then he has to like get the magic thing out his bum.
I mean,
but they do also the reason I brought it up was they do have like a very particular conversation about like even though they might die, they don't want the first time that they have sex to be that. Even if it might be the last chance, they don't want to be like forced by circumstances to make that choice.
So a little butt play is okay, but they don't want to have penetrative sex.
I mean, that's why it gets so interesting.
I mean, because that could have been fun. We weren't there. We don't know.
I mean, they were both beat up pretty bad.
Okay, never mind. That's different.
Yeah.
So it's a hugely intimate moment. They have possibly even a more intimate moment together than some people have when they're having sexual intercourse, because there's so much built into it. But Becca becomes a really interesting figure in terms of sex and consent in that way. Yeah.
I love thinking about Becca. Like, I compare Becca and Alanna in my first chapter of my dissertation because, like, I can't talk about all of them, even though as much as I would love to.
But you'd be here forever.
But Becca just sort of subverts or goes against a lot of the, like, most expected choice that, like, Alanna might make.
Yeah.
Because Pierce has then had these characters make these decisions before, so she can explore other options. And also because Becca is, like, again, like, of a lower class and not, like, she's not a noble. She doesn't come from, like, a noble heritage. She doesn't necessarily have a ton of resources. She does have some.
Things.
But,
yeah. I'm going to complicate your reading of Alanna when my book chapter comes out, by the way.
Oh, please do.
So we've been thinking a lot about people having sex, but also about the use of contraception, right? Stopping babies from happening. But kind of flipping that around, I think you mentioned that some characters or other characters, children, and there's like lineages that are being created in these worlds. So like, are babies, are families largely, family units, kind of lineages, are those important things in Pierce's work as well?
Yes, super important thing in Pierce's work, just to like go in there really bluntly. It's part of the world building, right? So you get 1983 Alanna, and then sort of in 2002, 2003, you get her daughter series, which is the one you've read with Sexy Crow Man. And so it's really cool, just in a sense, to see Alanna had kids, right? And she's gone through this complicated kind of romance and gender identity formation, right? In her series, she trades places with her brother to go to the palace to become a knight. While she's there, she doesn't stay pretending to be Tom, her brother. She becomes Alan, this boy in his or her own right. Interestingly, the novel does use kind of she, her pronouns throughout, even as she's adopting this kind of male subjective kind of identity. And she has these really interesting sexual relationships. I'm not convinced that her relationship with John is her relationship with John as much as it's Alan's relationship with John, which kind of throws a whole spanner into those works. So she finally lands with George, though. And they do have kids. She has these 3 kids. She has twins, Allie and Alan. I almost forgot there. And an older son called Tom, which is really interesting because it's kind of a playing out of the 3 kind of gender identities she adopts within her series. Kind of Allie is kind of her girl persona, Alan is her cross-dress persona, and Tom is the brother that she shares a bond with. And so she kind of resolves herself in her series, but then she has these babies that push that kind of gender identity and that self kind of onward. And then you get Dane, who's doing some really cool shape-shifting things because she ends up pregnant and is a shapeshifter and shapeshifts while she's pregnant. Her child is a shapeshifter. And ultimately she gets to this point where she has to shapeshift below the waist every time her unborn child does, else the baby might like kick itself out of her body.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Freaky.
But then nightmare fuel.
The really, really interesting one, which maybe is even more of a nightmare fuel. Allie and Nawat do get married. They do have sex and she gets pregnant. It's canon in that it's in the final Trickster book. It ends with like her staring down at the slight swell of her stomach and morning sickness that's kind of lasting throughout the day. And then in a short story that Pierce wrote, we get those babies being born, and it's really fantastically wonderful because Allie is convinced that she's going to give birth to or lay eggs rather than human babies. And it's super, super funny because Nawat, her crow turned human husband, is like, dude, eggs would be so much easier to give birth to because there's like no head and legs and arms and things. They just come out easier. And he's got a very kind of, and Allie just totally is like, shut up. She really is. She doesn't give birth to eggs though, but she does give birth to triplets. And again, it's this kind of playing out of self and like who are these women and who do these women become as adult women, and then who do they become kind of through the lives of their kids, which sexuality and gender identities are played with a lot in Pierce, but they become really prominent, I think, in those children because it pushes that boundary, right, of the kind of single, stable, heterosexual identity that we expect and want. And I'm using that in kind of the dominant narrative wants.
Yeah.
And Pierce is complicating that from the beginning. Yeah, go.
Also, building on just really quickly, when we think about then the use of birth control, when we see these women then choose to become parents later, that's important then thinking about that, like their choice to not have children could be their choice for now, but didn't have to be their choice forever. And it allows them then that agency to make that decision.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point too. If we're thinking about how characters change over the course of time, you know, how your mindset changes over the course of time. These are all fantastic and wonderful points. Just to pick up a little bit, though, on something Leah was saying, I feel like a lot of our conversation has kind of been sitting with very heterosexual conversations of sex and romance, right? So expanding our conversation a little bit, is Pierce talking about queer characters? Like, queer relationships obviously are a thing that exist, but is this something that Pierce is sitting with? Is this a spot that kind of falls outside of her purview? Is this something that she's incorporating into her worlds? Let's sit with that a little bit.
So I think it's important here to think about ways that queerness is incorporated into the books canonically, and then ways that it has been viewed, and ways that she might have tweeted about a character's identity, or ways that readers have read something, like particularly when we're thinking about Alanna. But I'll start with some of the canonical queerness that's in her books, because there is some, and I think it's important to acknowledge it and be clear about it. So, like in the Circle universe, there's a lesbian couple, Lark and Rose Thorn, and they are delightful. And what I think is particularly interesting about them is it is not clear that they are like a romantic couple in the first 8 books. But my sister recently was rereading the Circle of Magic Quartet and was like, and texted me and was like, Lark and Rose Thorn, they are gay. I cannot be convinced otherwise. And I was like, well, yeah, they are. But like that then becomes canon and is written into it in Will of the Empress, which was published in 2005. But then also in Will of the Empress, the context in which that comes up is that Daja, who is one of the 4 mains that world follows, discovers that she is in fact attracted to women. And there's a really interesting sequence where she talks about how she tried kissing boys before, but like it just felt odd. But then when she kisses Rizu, it feels totally different, and she understands like what people had been talking about. So in this book, Daja both becomes a character comfortable with her own queerness, but she also, I think sometimes, and I don't want to say this is universally the case, but a lot of the times being queer can become more of an identity question, and those characters don't always get to have like fully developed sexual relationships. But like in that book, Daja does, and it's really compelling. But what would you add, Leah?
Oh, well, just a really quick question, Leah, before you jump in there. This series that ends with The Will of the Empress, the last book is in 2005, but do we know when the series started? Is this all within, quote unquote, the new millennium, which also dates me as a phrase, or is this something that's been written over the course of like a decade or so?
I'm pretty sure the first 4 Circle books were in the early 90s.
Early 90s, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they were. I think that's what's really fun to track with Pierce, right? You've got there's definitely some queerness to Alanna's story, and I see it. And I mean, Jess Battis, who works on LGBTQI and stuff, has done a really cool article on kind of the queerness of Alanna's story. So it's there in kind of the 1980s, and I think that's where it's like there's canon, like overt, like yes, we're gonna like explicitly say this in the story, and then there's kind of those gray spaces, there's ambiguities where if you're looking for it, if you're open to it, you can probably pick some things up that maybe a straight het kid who's not looking for those things isn't going to pick up. And I think we need a mix of both, and I think Pierce gives us a mix of both, which is another reason she's so exciting.
So building on that, like what is both in the books and not is like one
Yeah.
take on it that Tamora Pierce has had is she tweeted, I think a couple of years ago now, that like there is a possibility that Alanna could be non-binary and might identify that way, but that Tamora Pierce like she didn't have the language for that when she was writing the books in the 80s. So there's a way that that is both freeing and limiting in the way that like representation both does and does not count if you like aren't saying it. I think that is very, very complicated.
Yes. It's an interesting one because I didn't need her to do that quote to kind of see it. But it's nice that she's acknowledging the possibility, I think, but doing it in such a way that she's also not saying this is now canon, you have to accept Alanna as this. I think she's going, this is a possibility. Yes, she might be gender fluid, and that's what I see in her, but maybe you see something else, which it's that kind of leaving things open to possibility, that kind of possibility of queerness, I think, that is so beautiful.
Yeah, y'all are so great. That's an excellent point. So we've been chatting for quite some time, and I have decidedly enjoyed myself. But to kind of wrap up here, to kind of bring our conversation to a close, are there any last things you want to bring to our listeners? Any lingering thoughts that you want to make sure people take away from our conversation today? ...
Pierce is amazing. Support her.
Yes.
Oh yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that too.
I mean, for me, it's this, and it's this underlining theme with YA fantasy, right? That it kind of snuck in under the radar. We expect realistic YA. Once we kind of got to this point where we're going to treat YA as kind of a legitimate area of study and a kind of area of literature and fiction that's doing cool things and doing interesting things, we go to the realistic stuff, right? That's the only place where those hard-hitting ideas are going to be dealt with. And fantasy and Pierce and others, Robin McKinley and Anne McCafferty and Deland, there's a whole group of women kind of on the back of second wave feminism in the 80s who are doing some really amazing things. Pierce sticks out because of her longevity, because of her attention to some of these really complicated issues that are complicated in her works. And fantasy gets short shrift. We don't turn to it to think about these big weighty ideas, but actually issues of identity and gender identity and consent and representation and what it means to live and be as a girl within this world, whether or not you menstruate or don't, or have the biological body parts we like to associate with being a girl. You can still be a girl in these fantasy worlds, or a boy, or a wolf if you're a shapeshifter.
That's what I want. I want to be a wolf.
Right. And I think that's why we need to give fantasy and speculative fiction a bit more credit than we do.
And on another thing that I would add to that as well is that in these stories that are often also about like defeating a particular villain or learning a kind of magic, like sexuality and sex is part of the story, but it is not the story. And that is something that is really important because like one of the things that I think Roberta Traits says about sex in YA is that sexuality, particularly in realistic problem novels, becomes like the problem to be solved. And when the problem to be solved is defeating the ultimate bad guy, then sex is something you learn and figure out along the way, and it is not necessarily the problem, but it is instead just part of growing up.
Yeah, if you're trying to deal with this sorcerer who has mad magic powers and he's trying to like take over the throne, sex isn't dominating the narrative. It's part of the narrative, but it's not dominating things. You got to watch out for the guy wielding the really strong magic. Yeah.
So, as Leah gestured to, you should all support Tamora Pierce. Tamora Pierce. I'm going to get it. She has a Patreon that she actually uses to support feral cat colonies. So if you want, you can go support Pierce's cat colony efforts. I always love a good cat support effort, so I'm putting that out there. But of course, you can find the variety of published works that Pierce has out there at your local bookstores or on things like I think it's bookshop.com and things like that. But why don't you guys do a little bit of a plug? We, of course, want to support Pierce, but we also want to make sure that our listeners are supporting y'all. So where can we find you on the big wide interwebs? Leah, you want to go first?
Yeah, I am on the Twitter. I'm using Twitter to distract myself from doing book revisions all the time. It's LE_Phil, PHILL. I'm also not necessarily the voice always behind the stuff coming from the YASA, Y Studies Association accounts, but I'm definitely part of that organization. And the Y Studies Association does have a website. Membership is free at the moment. You can join us. We do a critical theory reading group once a month. We have a fiction reading group every other month. And on Thursday, actually tomorrow, our fiction reading group meets and we're discussing A Song of Wraith and Ruin, which I finished reading last night. And I can't wait to talk to the fiction crew about that. Yeah, Twitter and
the YA Studies website.
The YA Studies website is the YAStudiesAssociation.com. So YAStudiesAssociation.com. And there's all sorts of really cool information on there. We have a like a YA critical theory database. There's a membership directory. We host the reading groups. We hosted a conference in November of 2020. We'll be hosting the next conference in November 2022. So there's just lots of really cool things happening in and around YA studies. So if you're into kind of YA lit, or you're a librarian or a teacher or you write it, there's kind of a home for you in YASA.
Yeah, definitely shout out to YASA. It's a great conference.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun.
It was good, wasn't it? Tiring. So tiring.
So you can find me I'm on Twitter. My sort of academic Twitter is I only have one Twitter. I don't know why I said that. But I am at Corinne_Catherine, and that is spelled CORINNE_KATHRYN. And you can also find me and Ayani on our podcast, which is called Sex, Love, Literature. And our handle for that, we're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook if you search Sex, Love, Lit.
All one word.
All one word. Where can we find you, Ayani?
Oh, nowhere. I am a mole and I live in the ground. And no, I'm kidding. You can find me on Instagram at Ayani Does Things, all one word, and Ayani is spelled AYANNI. And then on Twitter at Ayani Does Stuff, again, all one word. Very, very creative taglines. But excellent. So thank you both so much for this lovely conversation. Yeah. It's clear that you are bursting at the seams with things to say about Pierce. So needless to say, Leah, we will be looking forward to your book. Corinne will be looking forward to future articles and a dissertation maybe one day, hopefully.
Yeah, I'll write it eventually.
Write the dissertation. Yeah.
And this has been Tamora Pierce was our Judy Blume, sex ed in YA fantasy. I keep wanting to say outline because that's what's there. But Tamora Pierce was our Judy Blume, sex ed in YA. Thank you so much for listening.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.